Great. Hello, good evening. So my name is Jessica Rosa. I am a student here at CSUMB. It is with a major in mathematics and a stats concentration. And so we will be discussing private prisons in the United States. So going into it, I'm sorry. Let's click here. Okay,
and
beautiful.
it seems to have a little bit of a delay.
Okay, well, thank you. Bear with me. So I'm going to start off with a quote. It's actually from former President Obama. The United States is home to 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prisons. So this was a quote that he said when addressing the NAACP a few years ago, and I picked this because it adds so much value and so much weight to our problem that we face here in the United States, which is prisons. It's just how many prisoners we have, and we know that that's broken. So looking into costs and looking at that, just to start off, in the United States, it cost us $80 billion. So $80 billion is being focused into prison system. So this is housing, security, all of it, of $80 billion. So when we break it down, that's an average of $206 a year of taxpayer money, and that's across the board. So it's just an average going down to back in 1980 when that was $77. So what I did, I wanted to start off by just kind of doing comparison and looking at the cost versus our education. So focusing primarily in California, we're ranked 29th in spending for K through 12. So I think we can do better when you look at our cost per inmate, and we're ranked 6th in spending when it comes to prisons and the corrective system. And I mean, collectively, we can look across the board. There is no state that spends more in education than corrective, and the reason is it's more expensive. So of course it's more expensive to house inmates, to have security for inmates, to feed, and all of the necessary things that go around with that. But I think that we can definitely do better, especially for ranked 6th to ranked 29th, and I'll go further into that a little later. So what is a private prison? So what it is as you can see, we have it's a third party. So we pay taxes. The government then says that's too much. We have too many inmates. We need to house it elsewhere. So what we do is some of that money is paid to a third party to now govern and run a facility that's private. So what they do is they build these prisons, and then we create contracts with government agencies that say, okay, now we're going to give you inmates to really do that. So you can build a prison, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be profitable. You need to have a contract. So a government contract now ensures that you'll have 90% of your beds filled. Some of them are close to 100. And so looking into it a little bit, what sparked the inclusion of this, right? So why did we even start using private prisons? The reason for that was because we had too many. So of course, we can look back into history and think about when our government kind of stopped and said, we need to really address the issue of crime, the issue of drugs, and there is definitely a turning point where the sentencing became longer and there became more people being housed in prisons, and so there's too many. So we need to really house them, and so it was too much for the government to take on, so they contracted a third party to really just look at it in the private sector and really just as a business do something that would save us money in the long run, and who really knew what they were doing. So this is just kind of a visual representation of how many people are housed in prisons today. So this first pie graph looks at all of the different amounts of people in state prisons, local, federal, and then the one on the right, to your right is going to be immigration detention centers. So in terms of private prisons, it really only takes over 15% of the graph to your left, the pie graph, which doesn't seem like a lot, but when you look at the figures of how many are in the prison system, it still accounts for a lot. And then to the left, when you look at the immigration detention centers, it actually is nearly half, or I'm sorry, 3/4. So that's a good portion of it, and we'll get more into that later. So yeah, looking at it as a business, it's a profitable business. So it's a $4.8 billion industry as of 2015, so that's $629 million profit. And the reason I keep emphasizing profit is because that's profit for them, but we're still paying taxes. It's still a third party, so I want it to be known that still money that's being put in that profit is coming from our taxpayer money. So now I'm going to look into stocks. So I don't know if anyone knew, but you can actually buy stocks in private prisons. So when you look at the timeline, looking back to just what happened in our current election, there was 2 candidates, and one was for private prisons and when was not. So you can definitely see the trend of when we predicted that Hillary had a lead, and there was a definite decline in stocks of private prisons. But as soon as that was announced, that was not the case, and the candidate with 4 private prisons, that stock has risen back to essentially where it was prior to that. And so in a very short amount of time, you can see that and how that plays such a major role. So let's go into the pros and cons. So the reason we did that, and just going back to the history of it, the reason we did it was with good intentions. There was no malice in it. We're trying to save money. We're trying to find a solution. How do we house these prisoners in the best way possible? So we have to go back and just realize that's the good intent. So there's a broken system. There was a broken prior to private prisons. So now what do we do to fix that? So looking into just a little bit of the controversy, they're supposed to be safer. They're supposed to be cost efficient. But because of different laws that do not apply to private prisons, that's not exactly the case. So there's no data to really state that they are safer or they are saving us money in the long run. In fact, it's much different. So there are laws that require federal prisons, federal jail systems to really report and document all instances of whether it be violence or just issues with mental illness and procedures. All of it is transparent. When it comes to private prisons, those laws do not apply. They are given a pass in that realm, so we don't exactly know. But studies have actually shown that it's quite the opposite. When you look at who's being housed, they actually get to cherry pick who they get to let in. So that really eliminates the outliers of people who are older or people who have conditions that would require medical attention that would cost them more money. It also eliminates so one big thing that they said about cost saving, which is a big controversy, I'm going to safety, is that they're saving money. So the best way they do it is they have these better systems that have better monitoring systems, so they can really cut down on guards. And so that's one big issue, is that they have less guards, and they have more beds. So more body counts and less guards, so the ratio there is gone. So not reporting that is one big issue that we see. You need to report if there is violence and if you need more guards, if bodies are more effective in that way. Also, the turnover rate for guards is close to 50% in private prisons, which leads us to believe that those coming in or those leaving and those coming in to replace them are not as skilled, or they're inexperienced, and that's a big word, inexperienced, I'm sorry, not as skilled, and they're not being trained because they need to do it quicker, they need to be ready to go much faster than it would be. So longer time served on average. And the reason I point this out is because there's incentives for someone to stay longer. You're getting money, it's a per diem, so we're paying for each inmate, they get amount. So for them, it's beneficial to have a longer service, and we shouldn't have that mentality. The mentality should be about reform and paying your time and then kind of reforming from that. Like I said before, cost-saving promises, that needs to change, and that needs to become transparent so that we really feel that that's really saving us money. In the long run, if they're making this much profit, what are we doing that's not correct in our own system that we need to hire some other entity and really kind of look into that, back into the incentives and how someone is incentivizing on something that's already broken, and that shouldn't be the mentality of it. And then lastly, one that's very controversial is something that's fairly new. It's a pay-to-stay jail program. So they're much smaller jails, and it's for much smaller committed crimes. However, you can pay to pay out your time. So you can pay a little over $100 a day, and you can stay in a much nicer cell without the fear of aggression, and you can have a plasma TV, even in some nicer beds. It definitely creates an injustice further than just socioeconomic and racial divides. So on that end, that's pretty much where I leave it at. Thank you so much for listening. I'll open the floor to any questions or comments. Yes, thank you.
Do the private prisons have any requirements for benefits? If you work for the state or the federal government, you automatically get benefits because you're an employee like me. Is that not true?
So I'm glad you mentioned that, and that's actually going back to safety and cost. So there's a high turnover, and that's one big reason for it. So that's one huge way for them to save money, is to not pay as many guards, maybe not pay them the same as a federal of a government would. So that's one big reason for turnover. Someone can just start there, get an experience, and then hopefully work for the government as a plateau. But they're not paying, there's no requirement for that. So, and that's one huge cost saving. I believe labor is 70% of costs, so cutting down on that is huge for them. Yes, thank you.
Beautiful job.
Thank you.
And you may have it on your graph, I just didn't see it. Did you do a breakdown along racial lines of those?
I didn't go further into racial lines. There's definitely racial disparities within the public justice system.
Right,
And so, looking at it in terms of not working towards a reform
Right.
and just sticking a Band-Aid to it, I think shelves all these topics that are
Right.
so crucial to today, and it takes away attention. So now we're discussing issues of privatization and as a business model versus these actual racial disparities that need to be discussed and need to be addressed.
What's actually happening as opposed to what they tell us is happening.
Exactly, yes.
I have a question.
Mhm.
I'm working with the APA
Mhm.
on a fellowship, and one of the things we're looking at is school to prison pipeline. Do you want to talk later?
No, yes, absolutely. Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
It's a great combination, psychology.
Yeah,
and
no,
social
absolutely.
justice. Okay.
Wonderful. Thank you. Yes.
As a follow-up to that, you seem like a natural, passionate, knowledgeable person who can couple data with policy and data with kind of changes.
Right.
Is public policy something that might be in the future?
Interesting. I've never really thought about that, but thank you. I'd be happy to speak to you as well. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Yes.
So you've identified a real conflict of interest, it sounds like, between our government and the prison population. And I'm remembering the data that you showed with the stocks, and
Yeah.
it showed it was very high when Obama was president, and so I'm wondering, like, what was he doing? What was his government doing?
That's a good thought. And private prisons, let's look talking further back into the pros. The whole idea behind it and the positives behind it and the good intentions behind it was really to spark jobs and to, first of all, solve the issue of overcrowding in prisons. So we need to have other housing, and then having somebody who would do it in a more cost-effective and timely manner and really just allocate all of their attention towards that, to housing them, but also creating jobs within their communities. Everything that was required to house prisoners will stimulate an economy. And so something I referenced earlier was that there's some cities that have done this in hopes to really stimulate their economy, but haven't landed that government contract. So then there's no profit there. The money comes from that contract. The money comes from the per diem that's paid for each inmate that's housed per bed. Mm-hmm. But yes, it's shocking. It seems so transparent that there is an issue of conflict of interest. So that's why I feel if it really is something that's so beneficial in that sense and that the good intentions are there, the laws should be the same. It should be transparency. You should be reporting to the Department of Justice. Everything should be aligned if you're getting a contract and getting paid.
And one of the things, I don't know if you discovered it when you were doing your reading, but one of the issues, I'm old enough to remember this discussion in the 80s, I was teaching criminal justice. One of the pluses on the pro side was that those institutions were going to be able to provide rehabilitation services and all the things that weren't currently provided in public
Correct.
facilities. However, those are the first things to be cut when profitability goes. So
Exactly.
did you see any kind of evidence to
I
support that?
I didn't look further into the evidence, but yes, that's true. I've read that throughout, was that there is this promise that we're going to do it so much better, and there's going to be rehabilitation, there's going to be so many done, and then they present their own data, their own statisticians that kind of present their data, and that's why it's really hard, because at the beginning, that's what it was. It seemed that they were doing a much better job, and it was growing. And then when you realize that certain things didn't have to be reported, so like we talked about with the different inmate on inmate aggression, inmate on guard aggression, that's not reported. But also more shockingly is isolation is not reported. Mm-hmm. So now when they're looking at overcrowding, it's primarily in immigration. They're putting someone in solitary for days just because they don't have enough beds to house them. So now they're in a bed with solitary confinement, and it's because of an issue of overcrowding, and that doesn't have to be reported, and should absolutely be reported.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Very well
Thank you.
done.
Thank you,
All right,
Jessica.
well, thank you so much.